Well, now that Andrew has scared all of you down here, we'll start. So I'm honored to introduce the speakers for this presentation that Jeanette has organized and put together. They're all alums, which is interesting. Of course, they're all the best in their field, but they just happen to also be alums. And Michael Mawson just happens to be the person I know in this school the longest, save one, who is Scott Cohen. Scott Cohen, I know 1 year longer than Michael Mawson, and that's because they were both students at RISD. But Michael Mawson, the first history lecture I ever gave was just for Michael Mawson. How's that? And I just had to say that. At RISD. Michael formed Michael Mawson Architecture in 1995. He went to RISD, as I said, but he, of course, graduated from the GSD later. I'm not going to do a big bio thing. I just want to mention, certainly for each of the people, not the only housing projects, but a housing project that I hope each of them will show. And for Michael, it's the Star Apartments, the so-called Skid Row housing, because it was Skid Row Housing Trust of 2014, which is where he took this one-story existing condition and made a multi-story housing project out of it. And I think that'll be a very interesting presentation. Mimi Wong, also an alum who teaches at Columbia, in 1999 formed N Architects, which forever I thought was an architects, but with Eric Bungay. They've done some really interesting things in New York. A recent commission for there's one, you're going to show the Hong Kong project, but then the one you're not going to show the Hong Kong project, but the one in New York are micro apartments, which I think will be really interesting given the context of this. And then Jeanette, whom of course you know, started Karamu Kuo Architects in 2010. Also an alum and has done several housing projects. The Herxterstrasse, these are all competition projects. Yeah, they're all competition projects. But again, the one called More Than Dwelling, which she will show, is really interesting in comparison with Mimi's sort of micro apartments. And I think those two will make a good discussion. It's really, the fourth semester core is obviously important for a number of reasons, but not least of which is this issue of housing. We at the school have treated housing in different ways at different times. It's been in different places in the core at different times, but when Jeanette and Carlos took over as coordinators, co-coordinators, and Jeanette and I just this past summer talked about how we could bring back to fourth semester a more definite and precise social dimension. And her first suggestion was to reintroduce housing, but not just because it's housing, but because housing is also the primary stuff of the city. It's the primary fabric of the city. So it's not just it's not, and I think in America, and this, I think it is peculiar in the States, that there's something about when you say housing, it always means subsidized housing or social housing or something that often can have a stigma about its image. And this is not the case in the rest of the world. In the rest of the world, it just is the stuff of the city. And I think so it's really interesting here in the context of fourth semester, which is not just a housing studio, but is an urban, and how do we call the fourth verb? Relate. Thank you. It is about relation, and the housing as fabric, I think, is really interesting. Anyway, I'll stop. My departure is not ideological. It's because I have to introduce something else, but welcome. Thanks for coming.
Well, thank you so much. It's really a pleasure and honor for me to be back. My origin story, the N-Architect's origin story, is that I met my partner in Michael Hayes' class. So that's really good value for your tuition dollars. And so I was thinking on the way over here that, so I went through the MArch 1 program, but I don't remember having any sort of panel discussion about housing. We were just told to, this is the housing semester. But so this is a really amazing opportunity. And I think partly it's because the context and the need for innovative housing is much more interesting now and is much more necessary. So new technologies and informal economies have impacted how we work and how we live, and the way in which our domestic and private spheres have been atomized into the collective sphere, for better or for worse. And so micro-macro is as much a provocation to you as students to put your project's ideals in dialogue with how notions of collectivity and social engagement have been changing in the urban space. It's as much of a provocation to you as it is to us as a practice to always be projecting how micro moves can have macro impact. So I'm going to be talking about our micro apartment building and touching a little bit on a little thing that we did for Storefront, for a speculative project for Storefront. So Carmel, it's now called Carmel Place because that's what the developer wanted to call it, but we called it My Micro New York. And it was a pilot project. It was a competition launched by the former mayor's administration, the City Planning Commission, and the Housing and Preservation Development Department of New York. It was a pilot project meant to test the feasibility of reducing the minimum size of apartments, which then was 400 square feet, below that. And to be honest, when we were first invited, we were not sure. We felt a little bit unsure that we wanted to be, known as the architects of small things. It wasn't the grand plan that we had when we graduated from the GSD. But when we understood that it was on the backs of research that was pointing to a dramatically changed demographic and urban lifestyle, we were inspired to act. But the story of the micro unit actually starts with Jacob Riis, who was a Danish journalist, immigrant, turn of the century, who turned his cameras on the living condition of the urban poor, mainly immigrant population, and exposed the horrific crowding, the lack of sewage, lack of proper ventilation, and his book, How the Other Half Lives, because at that time it was literally half of the city's population was living in this condition. His book really shocked the civics leadership into action. And so the paradox is now that the housing regulations that we have and those, all the codes that we have are born out of this desire to greatly improve the tenement housing condition. But the paradox is that the American home has been ballooning since the 1950s, almost doubling in size, but the family unit has been shrinking. Why? Because we've changed. We are living longer, we are studying more, divorcing more, marrying later, etc., living greener. And the result is that nearly half of Manhattanites live by themselves. And this is a trend that is not only reflected nationwide, but also globally, where the rise of those living by themselves have risen by 30% in the last decade. And so the reality in New York, and I forget the statistics for Boston, but the problem in New York is that there are 1.8 small households, and they define that as 1 to 2 person households, and only 1 million suitable apartments, which means that there are a lot of us cramming ourselves into illegal sublets that are dangerous or commuting far. Those seem to be the two options, because the housing stock is simply geared towards a nuclear family that we are not. And so the ADAPT NYC competition asked the question, how small should an apartment be and still be livable? So the question for us was not just about how to make a small apartment good, but to rethink apartment living in general. And so we thought about, if you were shrinking the apartment, that you should still be able to find all the amenities that you would find in a house, just not in your apartment, but dispersed throughout the home. So what if we think about this idea of the dispersed home, where all the shared domestic amenities are somewhere in the building? And so we concentrated a lot on these collective spaces at different scales, so on every floor, but also at the scale of the building, and then in relation the building to the city, and really thought about those nested communities and put them in the best places so that they really have a connection to the urban context. So the gym is designed as kind of like a porch that opens to the pedestrian street in front. The lobby is super wide, super long, because we imagined that the whole building would be able to gather there for Thanksgiving dinner, but it literally connects one pocket park to the other. And then just getting into the massing, micro is not a very good word. It kind of starts to connote something that is diminished in experience or something, kind of small. So we didn't want the massing of the building to reflect the kind of the itty-bitty units on the inside. So the massing of the building is actually in dialogue with New York, with the kind of the typology, the brick typology of New York, the typology of brownstone windows, and also, taking what we have to do, which is all these setbacks for zoning, and maximizing those setbacks and creating a kind of expression, a massing expression. So it's conceived as 4 micro towers, almost like a microcosm of the skyline. It understands that it's not just an object, but it is related to the fabric of the city. So it's 4 shades of brick that kind of stitches and it responds to the white brick on the south and the dark brick of the public housing to the north in sequence. And the bricks even are oversized. If the apartment has been shrunk, we try to oversize everything. The brick is actually utility brick because we wanted the whole to be more than the sum of the parts. But the sum of the parts is actually very small parts because they were built modular beyond the second floor. So the site up to the first floor was in situ, and then all the modules were built in the Brooklyn Navy Yard across the bridge. In steel, it's basically steel construction, and each module is a self-supporting, structurally supporting module that literally stacks like Lego. And the factory is like a timeline because, as it moves up and to the left, it becomes more and more complete. The unit, and then exits the factory. So when the modules are lifted into place, everything is inside. All the finishes, all the plumbing fixtures, all the lighting, everything except for the appliances and the brick on the outside. But the windows are in and everything else. This will eventually. So the stacking took 3.5 weeks, which makes it sound really painless, but it wasn't. Everything was a module, including the stair and elevator core. So this is an exploded plan of the typical floor of all the modules, and all the units are studios, 265 to 370, I think, net. Interior space. So even within the logic of repetition, we're trying to find small moments for variety. And then in the sections, you can kind of see when they stack, you get double floor and double ceiling. You can kind of see this in that section. And of course, the same thing in plan. When they stack in plan, you get double walls. So the question for us on the inside was, if you shrink the size of the apartment, what should you give back? We thought we should give back in terms of the volume of the space. So what's interesting is that if you look at, if you think about size, not just in terms of area, but volume, we shrank the floor by 25%, but the volume only shrank by 10%. So it feels big, I think. We gave back in terms of ceiling height, so it far exceeds the minimum, and of course the size of the windows, which hopefully, make you, not think about the very small apartment that you're in, but actually focuses you on the view to the park across the street. So I wanted to, this is something that we did for Storefront. We really just worked on it for a week, but we're still thinking about these ideas. Storefront invited 30 architects to consider how we are in this kind of contemporary culture where we're really rethinking the idea of the common, sharing, the shared economy, etc. And so we were all given a slice of Manhattan. And our project was utopian and also dystopian, kind of, understanding that there are a lot of benefits to sharing, but there's also the dystopian side to sharing, things that you don't want to share, like your data. So we started by kind of questioning the singularity and the rigidity with which zoning and building codes define what a housing unit is. So starting with the programmatic unit. Program does not necessarily equal physical unit of space. It can be atomized. The social unit, of course, is always changing and resists boundaries and resists a kind of fixed definition. In reverse, the physical unit need not be the same as the family unit, the social unit, or the programmatic unit. And obviously the economic unit is not the same as the physical unit, as we now know through all this kind of shared economy with Airbnb, etc. What if we imagine a unitless housing that is completely dispersed, that would provoke a new way of inhabiting and engaging with the public realm and appropriating the city? So Key Party, you guys are probably too young to know what a Key Party is. I won't get into that. Key Party follows 6 tenets. First, we now live dispersed. Our houses no longer defined by walls, but spread across our blocks, our city. Our block is our home. Our city is our house. Everything is everywhere. One only needs a key. We have many such keys to everything. 3, we need to move around much of the time, like atoms converging and separating, delineating a different home every day. Our blocks are porous, our city laced with a myriad of shortcuts and public commons. 5, we don't need as much space, almost every space is used almost all of the time. And 6, for all the large and varied spaces we meet in, we retreat to as many small ones to find ourselves alone. So that was very quick, and we're still thinking about the idea, the kind of utopian and dystopian aspects of sharing and the zeitgeist of kind of collective co-housing, co-living that is very, very dominant right now. So back to my micro, we are of course bound by building codes, zoning codes, etc. that do limit what the unit is and how that is defined. And so we only were able to take the ideas of Storefront so far, but what we imagined was this kind of very dense, overlapping social kind of units occurring in the building because it is such a dense building. And so we finished my micro last June. Move-in was June, and it was completely occupied in 2 months. Our current mayor has a very big agenda for affordable housing. This is 55 units. It's not going to make a very sizable dent, but we are very proud that out of those 55, 40% is affordable. And so that means 22 units. But out of those 22 units, 8 went to formerly homeless veterans. So that leaves 14 units. And for those 14 units, there was a lottery and there were 60,000 applications, which doesn't make me feel good, actually. It just points to the extreme necessity for housing that reflects our diversity. And so what we hope is that through the very micro moves of this project, it will eventually lead to macro changes in how the city thinks about a really diverse housing stock. Thank you.
So I come from a slightly different context. I would say we take now a very short excursion to Zurich, Switzerland, where housing actually has been an ongoing and long-running, I would say, tradition, both in terms of design and competitions. And what that did was essentially liberate us a little bit to also think about maybe more what that could mean as design strategies, both in terms of organization, but also as a kind of spatial exploration. So today I'll be presenting 2 housing projects from our office that confront a few recurring themes that we're interested in. One is the idea of architecture that operates urbanistically, that regardless of how big or how small a project might be, it has the potential of to catalyze an urban attitude that reconfigures its context. At the same time, we're interested also in what this urban attitude means as an interiority, how it may define a spatial experience on the inside that is inseparable, in fact, from this urbanity, and one might argue even is characteristic of it. And of course, how these issues then tie into ideas of flexibility within the constraints of a built reality. I don't know if any of you are familiar with Aikido. Aikido is a form of martial arts, which is particular in the sense that it's not an aggressive practice like jiu-jitsu or karate. In Aikido, instead of attacking, you wait to be attacked. In fact, it's all about using the energy of the attacker to then flip the situation. It's a subversive type of offense that's disguised as defense. It requires you to be aware of your context and to, in some sense, anticipate what is coming your way so that with the least amount of energy or an effort, you would be able to control the situation. You can say that we've been trying to look for the Aikido way of designing, and especially in housing where there's a lot of constraints and regulations, to accept and even to embrace these constraints and the realities of codes that are thrown our way, and to rechannel them as design tactics. Each time that we start a project, we assess what we can or cannot control, not because we want to be pragmatists, but because for us it's important to concentrate our energy on the right things. We're looking for a robustness in architecture that's not defined through a forceful imposition, but a robustness that emerges from a very specific and maybe even very simple reading of the given set of conditions in order to find the effective moment of intervention. It's like the table in this dynamically evolving dinner party, a thin, stable line that loosely contains the ensuing chaos. I don't think that we have a single approach in terms of how we design a project, and in the case of housing, that's even more so. Also, what takes priority is never really the same. Sometimes it's a site, sometimes it's the typology, sometimes it's the image. We're also not necessarily interested in a kind of signature style that would be fashionable only for a time, but there are a few things that we're fascinated with that reappear, especially in the kind of housing projects, and that has to do with the relationship, for example, between the hyper-rational and the completely irrational or unpredictable. For example, between the abstraction of the plan and the resultant spatial experience, and trying to understand how one feeds the other. Another has to do with the embracing of differences, to not always seek to unify everything under one overarching order, but to let the multiple conditions enrich the project. And lastly, it's important to us that the architecture is a space for people whose actions we cannot predict and whose needs change over time. We think of ourselves as designing frameworks or flexible infrastructures within which a number of possibilities can occur. The first project is a very small housing project that we won through a competition last year, and if all goes well, we'll be beginning construction in a few months. The site is in a suburb of Zurich, a small triangular plot at the bifurcation of the main regional road. It's such a difficult site to make lucrative that it was the last remaining plot to be redeveloped. What you see currently on the site is actually an old single-story farm shed that has been there from the 1950s. After all the setbacks that are required, the buildable footprint gets quite minimal. The client, however, saw an opportunity there to tap into a market of young commuters looking for urban character, but in a cheaper context than Zurich. In order to make his investment viable, we had to maximize the building envelope and the rentable square meters. This often means to take advantage of the allowance for an attic floor. we discovered that there was a kind of particularity in the zoning codes of this town, which is different from the typical Swiss codes. What you see on the left, which is a typical, what happens in a typical Swiss city, the additional attic floor or penthouse is only allowed if it is set back from all sides and inscribed within a kind of gable roof. Most developers, though, want a kind of roof terrace, which rules out the gable, but results, therefore, in this all too common hat on top of a building. In this town, which is ruled very differently, the only restriction imposed on the attic floor was that it may not exceed 60% of the area of the floor below. In addition, we were allowed to have punctual overhangs beyond the buildable envelope as long as they do not exceed a third of the facade length. So this is traditionally used for example, a bay window. And for us, we were interested in interrogating these kind of conventions because of, again, the kind of proliferation of these types of buildings with the kind of, let's say, attachments or growths above. So by reinterpreting these two rules, we were able to preserve the purity of the volume at the narrowest moment of the site, reinforcing a kind of urban presence. At the same time, it became a game of negotiation between the exterior form and the interior area. Instead of responding to each site or programmatic condition as an additional volume, we allowed the volume itself to mutate, to peel away, or merge where necessary, so that in the end, the building seems to constantly change as you move around. So this is actually, essentially different sides of the massing model. There is an ambiguity between the reading of a singular form and the expression as an aggregation of multiple forms. Given the particularities of the triangular parcel, we were interested in understanding the possible organizational strategies. But we quickly realized that the research was irrelevant. Beyond the difficulty of the triangle, the buildable footprint was only roughly 200 square meters, with the tip of the form being less than 4 meters wide. It meant that we were only able to get 2 average-size apartments onto each floor. We wanted to come up with living experiences that would capitalize on the form rather than fight against it. For us, it was interesting to think of 2 spatial anchors, a panorama room that would be the selling point for the narrow apartment to the west, and a central living hall that would characterize the deep plan of the eastern apartment. With the eccentricity of the form, we needed to find an alternative organizational principle that was also a critique of the banality of most housing plans that essentially tries to rationalize within a grid-like subdivision. At the same time, we were also critiquing the laziness of the loft trend, which essentially absolves the architect from designing space by claiming that the open generic should be the answer for all. Here, we proposed a cellular subdivision that produced 2 distinct unit types. On the left, you see a kind of barbell type, what we call the barbell type, which is a linear sequence with a room on one end and the panorama room at the sort of narrowest point. And on the right, you see the kind of radial plan organized around a central living unit, a kind of undefined central hall, which could be used for all sorts of purposes, but also eliminated the necessity for corridors. So all distribution happens, in fact, through this kind of central space into both outdoor, let's say, terraces as well as bedrooms. So here you see a model shot. So this is, we work a lot in large physical models. This is a shot of a model of the panorama room. And here a model shot of this central living hall. The penthouse apartment had its own logic that responded to the geometry of the building and is characterized by 2 distinct outdoor spaces. This is a unit that will be occupied by the owner, the client, and it's a unit that's separated by a core, or separated into 2, let's say, areas, the private quarters being to the east, the kind of larger package at the end, and then to the west, a kind of enfilade of rooms that lead gradually to the outside, so through the kitchen into a kind of outdoor walled garden. And the walled garden allowed us, in a way, to maintain the purity of the volume, because the actual allowable square meters to be built for the penthouse was only until the end of the kitchen that you see there. But this also allowed us to provide for a kind of more intimate outdoor space, a kind of spill-out dining area, let's say, that was at this very exposed, let's say, bifurcation of the streets. So it was a kind of exterior interiority, and that again provided for a kind of sequence of experiences. To the south, the apartment opens up onto a sun deck where the clients could entertain with views towards the lake. So you see here, the kind of enfilade of rooms out onto this sort of intimate outdoor terrace at the end. The next project is actually one that Michael had referenced earlier in his introduction, which is competition for a cooperative housing project in Zurich that would provide affordable housing in a very expensive city. This was a kind of public and private initiative in a way, and for us it was an opportunity to think about how to provide quality within the constraints of cost. The brief asked for the design of a prototype system that could be adapted to accommodate a wide range of apartments, from studios to 10-room co-living units, and that they wanted to be able to reconfigure also in the future. The site is on the rapidly growing periphery of Zurich, which you see here, where the typical development is a high-density sprawl of singular buildings, creating an ambiguous urbanism where the public spaces were not dense enough nor active enough to be truly urban, and nor were they significant enough to be quality outdoor space. So it's a kind of high-density suburbia. We were highly critical of that condition, and therefore, rather than propagating the same strategy of singular volumes, we proposed to use the development as a conservation strategy. Urbanistically, we proposed a single gesture of a large ring that would demarcate and preserve a large park in anticipation of the densification that would begin to encroach around it. The park would then serve not only the residents of the project, but also the neighborhood with restaurants and cafes that would spill out, as well as community gardens and playgrounds. The residents would then also be the custodians of this amenity. So all the entrances to the housing units would then be from the park, activating this interior world. From the outside, the park would be a hidden paradise, a lush interior world that is a contrast to the monotony of the sprawl beyond. Volumetrically, the ring was not a pure extrusion, but expressed itself almost as a collection of buildings forming its own urban skyline. The urban form presented us. I need to turn off the. How do I turn off the volume? I'll just let it play through for a while. I'll have to shout a little. Anyways, the urban form presented us with a very particular typology of the slab building, which, if we take in its most banal and extreme manifestation, is that of the post-war socialist prefab housing. So the video here is a short film made by Sergei Hein, a parody of the Berlin Plattenbau, or prefab building, rethought as a Tetris game to inject some variation into an otherwise relentless repetition. We like the video because it embodies one of the central dilemmas we face in housing. Collective housing is a typology of contradictions. While building codes, environmental concerns, and market forces demand repetition and sameness at the scale of the overall building, individual lifestyles demand diversity on the scale of the unit. We asked, what if this contradiction can instead become a synergy? Sorry. So housing is often guided by an economic logic that demands a certain amount of flexibility, yet still retaining a clear system. It's why behind the facade, the structure is more often than not defined by the maison domino. But if the regular spacing of columns allows complete freedom in plan, why couldn't the section also be liberated from repetition to produce spatial differentiation? We discovered that Swiss building code allows for a 90-centimeter sectional drop without having to install guardrails. By taking advantage of this loophole, we can generate a continuous and undulating living landscape that could then be freely configured and reconfigured in the future. The shifts would register on the floor of some apartments and on the ceilings of others to create spatial diversity. The sectional freedoms was then offset by a rigor in plan. The entire building was structured through regular bays, separated alternately by shafts and cores. This created an efficient vertical alignment despite the freedom of the floor plates. At first glance, the plans appear strict and relentless, but on closer inspection, they display a great variety of apartment types and spatial differentiations. And what is maybe even not apparent here is that some of these units, in fact, go multiple floors. To systematize the three-dimensional relationships, we developed an alphabet based on three basic types: the shotgun, the diagonal, and the corner units. Three-floor system allowed us to unleash a sort of controlled freedom that always returned to a flat floor after three stacks. One of the codes, let's say requirements also in Zurich, is that 30% of any housing development had to be ADA accessible, which basically meant that we could not always have this kind of alternating landscape, but that we had to develop a system that took that into account. So the system allowed each unit to have its own spatial character while still allowing for future reconfiguration. Each unit, we also made sure, had to have exposure on two sides, one towards the park and one towards the kind of urban edge, and each had to have a high space that would be gained through this sectional shift. So even with these rules, we were able to produce, in fact, a large number of unit types that allowed for individual appropriation. The building can be understood as an open system, an infrastructure for different lifestyles and desires that invites the inhabitants to appropriate the spaces for their imagination. Thank you.
I wanted to give a little bit of context to our work doing housing, because while it's a significant part of the work of the office, it's also a type of work that I'm particularly interested in at a very personal level. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that when I was educated as an architect, being taught by Michael amongst others, it was at a moment when modernism and postmodernism were in a deep argument with each other, and it was unclear which of those two ideas was potentially going to win or win out or move forward. But in both of those cases, housing was a fundamental typology, a fundamental building block that we worked with in housing studios, but also understood as one of the drivers of those two very different attitudes towards architecture. Housing was a project type where architects strove to intertwine housing with the most progressive and optimistic approaches towards space, technology, ideas about living and politics. And I was, as I mentioned, deeply influenced by that work, but I also came to believe that architecture and the architecture of housing was an agent through those typologies of change and progress. And with housing at the center of that idea, I came to believe that that was one of the ways forward for architecture to have a deeper engagement with society, with culture. It's an idea I still believe in. We know these type of images largely from architectural history. Housing as a concept of a new, optimistic world. And we also have seen these images as well, which fairly or unfairly became icons of architecture's perceived role in the diminishment of the progressive possibilities of housing and largely divorced from the complexities of the surrounding city. And out of this complicated history of modernism, architecture lost its roles, or at the very least, people became suspicious of its role as an agent of ideas and solutions, and perhaps most importantly, about its role in speculation about the future of the city. Almost simultaneously, the emergence of the single-family home in post-war suburbs and cities like Los Angeles largely overrode the conversation about collective and multifamily housing, as well as many of the defining issues of the city itself, identity, density, and community being just a few of those important issues. But in many cities, and especially in Los Angeles, the manifest destiny-like expansion and sprawl to the periphery has slowed. Density, mobility, affordability, and community are pressing concerns, and housing is again an important model for understanding how we address those priorities. But also, and maybe most importantly, to begin to reimagine the city itself. These two concerns, the evolving pressures of the contemporary city and architecture's role, especially housing's role, in grappling with these challenges and anticipating the future city, are driving forces in our approach to housing. I'd argue that housing is nothing less than a microcosm of the city itself. I want to talk about three projects this afternoon, all in Los Angeles, and three projects that are at completely different scales, but I think represent a fairly broad range, representative range of the kind of work that we're involved with in housing. And I want to start with the house itself, which is arguably the fundamental housing type in Los Angeles, and maybe the fundamental housing type in general. Houses contain many of the questions about our lives and cultures, and if you track much of the theory about houses, back to Alberti, Yona Friedman, the idea of the house and the city as two completely intertwined and interlocked entities is, I think, an important concept. This is a project in the San Fernando Valley in Los Angeles, on the edge of the kind of continuous sprawl which you see on the left of the image, the quintessential post-war suburb. The house is located right on the threshold of that sprawl and the Angeles Crest National Forest, which stands as the backdrop for much of Los Angeles. You spiral up to the house and finally arrive at the top of this hill. The house is a kind of autonomous object at the top of that hill, much more inward-facing, separate, and in a sense caught between these two very different but very characteristic environments in Los Angeles. It's also immediately adjacent to the Cyrulnik House, which is a 1950s house of Richard Neutres, one of the quintessential small modernist houses whose primary idea was to create this transparency, this sense of connection between the environment, the outside, that surrounds it, a small core on the inside, but largely connected to an idea, maybe even a romantic idea, of a connection to the outside. Our house, the Pittman Dowell house, is really the alter ego to the Cyrulnik house. When Neutra built this house, he built it or designed it and developed two other flat building pads immediately adjacent to the Cyrulnik house, with the idea that other houses, largely probably designed by him, would occupy those pads. And it was an idea, even in the singularity of the Cyrulnik house, of a kind of collective, maybe even a slightly socialist approach to the idea of the single-family house. So even then, this site was meant to be a group of houses joined loosely. But that idea of transparency and connection is a complicated one, especially complicated one in our contemporary culture. And Larry Pittman, Roy Dahl, two painters, also professors at schools in Los Angeles, have very public lives. They lecture a lot. Their work is exhibited a lot. They're very much, they're very visible, almost public intellectuals in the city. And that combined with this idea that our lives, in many ways, are almost constantly connected and public, led to an idea that the new house, that maybe the Cyrilnik house was a modern house, but maybe it wasn't necessarily a contemporary house. The idea that started to develop from that was that this house would have much more of an internal life, where maybe more of the transparency was really on the inside, as opposed to the exterior of the house. And in these plans, in the plan on the right, you can begin to get a sense that not only the geometry starts to connect the different rooms, loosely defined, living room, dining room, kitchen, library, bathroom with the master bed, or the singular bedroom, really in the middle of the seven-sided object, with then a courtyard on the inside. There's also an incredible amount of transparency where you can see from one space through to another space, and the traditional hierarchy of closed or personal spaces largely gives way to a space that is almost completely interconnected through one-point perspectives, and also a series of type of perspectival pivot where spaces are connected along and through your peripheral view. And here you can see the bathroom on the left, master bedroom, courtyard, and living room in the center, and the library on the right. That idea of simultaneity, of a kind of spatial simultaneity, one in which we live in multiple spaces, arguably at the same time, if not physically, at least virtually, is potentially one of the great spatial problems, I think, for architecture at this moment. And while it had a particular form that was developed from it in a house, and probably more easily controlled in a house, I think that idea also has resonance in how potentially groups of individuals or communities start to get built, what kinds of spaces can be more active in a physical way in starting to create a series of relationships, and also how that relationship grows eventually to the scale of the city itself. We've been involved for a number of years, almost 10 years now, working with a nonprofit developer, housing developer called the Skid Row Housing Trust, whose history has been to develop housing for the homeless. And the majority of those projects, up until we got involved with them, were more typical SRO-type hotels or shelter-like buildings where people might stay for a couple of nights, a week, if they were lucky, maybe a couple of months, but we're constantly cycling through those buildings. When we got involved, it was because they were changing their model from the SRO type to something called permanent supportive housing, where if you're chosen to live in these residences, you can ostensibly live there for the rest of your life. They become very much your home, and that puts an added burden on the buildings to try to build a kind of true community that can grow and sustain itself over time. Star Apartments is the third of the projects that we've worked on. We've actually now just completed a fourth and are are early in design on a fifth project with the Housing Trust. You can see it in the lower right-hand corner. It's 101 units. And that idea of supportive housing is that there is the unit, but there is also a kind of collective life and supportive services that are brought into the building that is a part of the residents' ongoing daily life. Star Apartments is immediately adjacent to Skid Row. A lot of our projects have been on or around Skid Row, although increasingly they're starting to move outside of that part of the city. But this project is immediately on the edge of Skid Row. One of the things that the Housing Trust was concerned about was that they were becoming so successful at building these buildings in Skid Row that in a sense they were starting to build an equivalent to the projects that I showed in the beginning, one building at a time, every 60, 70, 80 units at a time. And they had a deep concern about what kind of effect these projects could have with the city as a whole. And one of their goals was to do more mixed use, not only residences, but ground floor retail, which doesn't seem like a extraordinary thing, with the exception that if you take some of the subsidies that they do from housing departments, which probably won't exist much longer, to build these projects, there's a very clear regulation that you're not allowed to be in the retail business. You're not allowed to be in the commercial business in that way. You're not allowed to operate retail spaces. But it turns out there was a loophole, and that loophole said that if you owned already an existing building that had retail, or you purchased a building that had retail, that you could keep the retail uses. And the trust bought the building, which you see on the top, which we changed. It had more or less a sacrificial facade. But the structure of the building, not so different than Maison Domino type, concrete frame, concrete podium that used to have parking on top, was something we reused as the base of the building and then needled down through with additional structure, created a new concrete tray on which a series of prefabricated units were stacked, leaving more or less this middle zone as a space where there was the opportunity to begin to create a collection of more of the social spaces one floor up from the building. You can see the building here, more or less, the apartments more or less floating over that recreated existing building. Density is a significant ongoing and new challenge in Los Angeles, as it is probably in many later, certainly post-war cities. It's not an issue that you often think about in a place like Los Angeles, but it's increasingly becoming a real issue. And here we were trying to create a kind of hyperdensity with these units, which also meant that that in-between space, the social space, became that much more important. An additional development in this project, which was unusual in Los Angeles, was the use of multifamily prefabrication, which until this project was not allowed in Los Angeles for some very arcane building code rules. But part of our work in the beginning was to, before we even started to design, was to be the advocate and really the negotiator with the city to develop this kind of pathway, with this project being a pilot program, to allow for prefabrication as a test of its validity in the city of Los Angeles. And this now has led to a pathway for other developers to potentially use. The ironic part about that was that in Los Angeles, most times, almost everything is built, almost all housing is built with wood framing, stick-built construction coming out of the single-family residence. And for code reasons, we had to do the same thing. There's no prefabricators anywhere near Los Angeles because it hasn't been a technology that's been used. We had to go to Boise, Idaho to build these units. You see in the middle slide on the left, they're coming down the interstate. Two at a time, they came to the site. The pallet was cut in the middle, and then they were lifted into place, also just under 4 weeks for the 101 units. In that middle space, this idea of a kind of microcosm, maybe not so much even of the city, but as a condensed community realm, started to be developed. There are they're supportive spaces for healthcare, psychological care. There's classroom spaces, art classroom spaces. There's a half-court basketball that's about to be installed. There's a jogging running track that runs around the entire side for exercise. TV room, community garden, and quite large community garden that goes along with the community kitchen. This is just one of the views of these planters right after the building was opened, and actually you can see a little image of the jogging track in front. In contrast to the scale of the individual unit, which is quite small, studio spaces that are just about 250 square feet, it's just as important to try to imagine in these buildings a scale that really is at the scale of collective space. And this is where the basketball court is going, where the building almost becomes a kind of piece of infrastructure, collective or social infrastructure, quite raw in its detailing and its construction, but more at the scale of the city. Over time, most times I draw on this image. I realized I can't today. But you can see a bunch of red dots, which are all these smaller and sometimes not so small iterative projects. And the point for me here is that while often cities develop with large, significant, often commercial developments at a scale at the scale of a coliseum or a large retail enterprise, that potentially these incremental projects taken together as one ongoing large project can have just as significant ability to remap or change your sense of the city. And for me, that is very much what those collective Skid Row projects are trying to do in their ambition to continue to move some idea about the city forward. But I also want to finish with a project that, in a sense, dispenses with that idea of smaller scale or iterative scale. And that's a project that was finished about 2 years ago, One Santa Fe, immediately adjacent to SCI-Arc, if any of you know that, but also immediately adjacent to the Los Angeles River, and at a threshold between the downtown and Arts District and the towers of downtown and Boyle Heights, which is the heart of the Latino community immediately across the river. The building, if it was stood on end, would be, this diagram is probably changing all the time, but would be about the 7th largest building. But what's, in a sense, important about that is that the building, while it's not tall, is at the scale where it's almost ambiguous whether it's a building at the scale of a building or really at the scale of urban design. And there are moments when it starts to almost fade into the context, where its scale, its texture, its horizontality starts to become part of a middle ground between the foreground and the background of this part of the city. It has a fairly simple stacked organization, commercial and on the ground floor, about 70,000 square feet. There's parking partially underground in the widest part of the site, but when the site gets very skinny, we couldn't put parking underground, so it sits in a sandwich between the retail and then all of the housing up above. This is about 425 units of a mix of market rate and affordable housing, 80% market rate, 20% affordable housing. The building is larger than much of its context and feels at times intentionally like it's floating as another layer on top of the existing context of the city. And that idea of not so much scraping the city or removing the existing context, but starting to build as a more layered approach to development and density of the city certainly comes from the last project, Star Apartments, but was very much on my mind here. It has an extraordinary length, as I mentioned. It creates a completely new street wall, but then has a series of more episodic moments that are connected to the contingencies of the context around it. Here you see one of the spiral ramps for the parking, but just beyond that, a very large portal that cracks through the building, comes under this bridge-like part of the structure, and if the image continued to the left, you would see that it continues out to the train tracks, where there is eventually going to be a new mass transit line. And that anticipation of the connectivity in the city and the way housing might grow up around it and also sponsor some of that development in the city was very much on our mind. I mentioned that it was an 80-20 building in terms of its affordability, but I think its real affordability is actually in its diversity of unit types. There's the most typical 1- and 2-bedroom units. There are some studios, there's some very small micro units, and then there's some very large units, 4-bedroom, 8-person units. And it's at those two ends of the very large units and the very, very small units where the greatest amount of affordability actually exists. And so the goal in this project is not just to designate a certain number of units to be affordable, but to try to change the unit in such a way that it provides more opportunity for different types of individuals, but also larger groups, for instance, 8 friends, to get together and lease one of these units. This is a view from the river, which is starting to change dramatically from what has largely been a stormwater culvert to something which is becoming much more the center of the city and a real civic amenity. It's still a ways off, but it's imminent in the city. Part of the plan of One Santa Fe developed a series of moments in the building where bridges will be able to cut through the project or leap from the project and eventually connect across the train tracks and to the river. Those could be many things. In this case, they're smaller community gardens. They don't have to have this form necessarily. But this idea was a part of the entitlement agreements in the city to allow a project at this scale to take place. That question of scale, for me, in relationship to housing, and especially in relationship to how it continues to develop the city, is one I've spent a lot of time concentrating on, and especially in this project. One of the things that we've been criticized for with this project in particular, we've gotten a lot of support. The project has gotten praise as well, but it's gotten a lot of criticism for being too big, for being out of scale with the city that surrounds it. And I've heard that criticism, and I understand it. And if you believe that the city, and a city like Los Angeles, is going to remain, and the scale of the city is going to remain as it is today, then that criticism is probably correct. But I think there is a reasonable argument, and I think it's not even so much an argument, but an emerging reality, that density and scale in contemporary cities is going to continue to grow. And in that sense, it is absolutely the responsibility of architects and planners to not only imagine how we begin to deal with the problems, especially around housing today, but to use those typologies and the tools that we have to begin to project and speculate and to anticipate potentially what the scale and what the future of the city will look like, and to make buildings that point to potential ways of beginning to develop an image that future city. Thank you.
Yeah, we'll take advantage of this atmosphere. Well, and thank you so much, Mimi, Janet, and Michael, for such precise and inspiring presentations. And when I say precise, It's very unusual, actually, I have to say, that when we ask people to come to the school to talk about a topic, they respond so precise and so generously. So really, thank you so much. I think it comes at a very good time for the fourth semester studio, and we can take lots of lessons. That's true, and don't laugh because it's really true. I mean, just you really ask people and they talk about the same thing all the time, and then you've made really an amazing effort to talk about what you were asked to talk about, and I think it's a fantastic, shouldn't be unusual, but it's extremely unusual. Well, let's leave it at that. No, I wanted to start really, I guess I'm going to ask a sort of a difficult and at the same time very simple question, but I'd like to start building on the arguments that Michael was presenting at the beginning of his intervention, and I would say to once again insist on this context that housing was very, very much at the center of the agenda and the investigations of modern architecture. And for some reason, over the past few decades, quite a few decades, it seems that housing is no longer at the center of the architectural discourse. And it's been really definitely the time in which most housing has been built than ever before anywhere in the world. And one really wonders why architects, in a sense, have been looking elsewhere. One could say almost the same about, that's not at all a negative note or a pessimistic note. On the other hand, a very positive one I would like to end on. But one would say that we're feeling that more and more also most architecture schools have, it was almost nicer before, but anyway. That most architecture, yeah, what's the point? What's the point in seeing me? I think you want to see them, actually. Yeah. No, I was saying that also it seems that to some extent many architecture schools have almost given away the notion of housing in their curriculums. And I think to some extent for many years both practice and academy have almost abandoned, given away and given up housing. And I think in a sense, or seeing the work today, which is of course not alone, and whatever, there's lots of people, of course, lots of wood architects that are also very engaged with housing, and I think it's something that, in a sense, I would like to take the opportunity there to not just to insist on the importance on the pedagogy and the disciplinary use of housing in the school, but really to reclaim also the role of housing in the advancement of architectural knowledge and architectural culture. So thank you also for that very much. So having said that, we all know that housing, as also Michael was saying, like any other word, the meaning of words change and travel through time. And when we say housing, we don't mean the same that someone meant by saying housing in Red Vienna or in the Frankfurt of Ernst May or in post-war Europe or even in the 1960s and 70s in the incredible efforts of housing both in Europe and in the States and in Asia, of course. But so in a sense, we should also start by asking what do we mean, almost paraphrasing Raymond Carver, what we talk about when we talk about housing in the 21st century. So in order to do that, I would actually just throw a question to the three of you, like saying, I could do that exercise, but I'm not going to do that. I'll let you do that. Despite the main differences in terms of cultures, climates, codes, and so on and so forth, what would be, in a sense, the commonalities? So given there's many given constraints, and both particularly the three of you, but particularly Jeanette and Michael, spoke how you found loops in the codes of housing, which are very important, and that's a very important thing for architects to do, to try to use codes productively. But we have all of those given constraints. What would be the self-imposed constraints? What would be the commonalities? What would be the common topics of contemporary housing, regardless of the specific cities and codes and climates?
I think that really, really depends on where you are. I'm thinking about. I always think the grass is greener on the other side, whatever side that is. But and we haven't done that much housing, but in New York, and we have a current project going up in Hong Kong, a tower, the demand for efficiency, which is a terrible word, but, which relates to the ratio of the domestic leasable or rentable space versus the shared space. The demand for high efficiency is extreme because of the cost of building. So I would say that there's a kind of sliding scale of how you can maximize and make as opportune as possible the shared spaces. When I look at the housing models of Vienna, for example, where the entire development and ownership structure is very, very different. It's very much a public-private partnership, and the developer actually maintains, which is very different. But it is, there's libraries, there's cafes, the kind of, they don't even talk about efficiency. But when I started working in Hong Kong, the apartment unit in New York, I think it's 84%. Hong Kong is 90%. That is the minimum, because the land cost is actually 2/3 the entire project cost. So that, the sliding scale of, how much you can do for the shared space, I think is the commonality, but it really widely changes depending on where you are.
I mean, maybe just to plug into that a little bit, I think that one of the key issues, obviously, and also what we're confronting with the studio, has to do with an idea about how to live together. And what I think is important with housing is that pervades through different scales. So, like Michael was saying, even regardless of how small that project is, it's an attitude that's about, also urban living. So, it goes from the level of the unit, what you begin to share within the unit, but what you begin to also share beyond that, and what that actually means in terms of how we are as a society today. So one of the things, in a way, that is interesting, obviously, is about the responses that we would have, and that goes from the projects that we showed, that I showed from our office, but also I think to what was being shown by Mimi and by Michael as well, which has to do with how do we deal with the kind of changing demographics that is, very, very obvious right now, and also how do we deal with, issues in terms of how these structures may even evolve in the future. So the idea of developing systems that are viable and efficient, but still retain a kind of quality, beyond that still also retains a kind of vision beyond that, I think is probably one of the key elements that ties it all together.
When you asked the question, I was thinking about the commonality between potentially the three presentations. And the thing that struck me, and it often strikes me about architects who are really taking on a question of housing, is an attitude towards invention, or an ambition, I'd say more an ambition towards invention. The idea that you're looking to try to find something that moves the conversation about not only housing in a physical way forward, but the way in which it meets how people are living at that moment, or might be starting to live in a particular way. So whether that's at a very precise level of changing the volumes through section, very precise take on dealing with a very small micro scale unit and how that starts to have greater generosity. How to deal with prefabrication as a technology that hasn't existed really in a city. Each of those are ways of taking on architecture and its invention based on some very clear constraints. And that almost, you always hear that about housing, but I think it's actually true about why housing is potentially so powerful.
Yep.
because within all of those constraints and those rules and regulations and economies and developer and client needs, there still is, I believe, this incredibly vibrant way of representing an idea about living. And that, to focus on that, I think gives you a way of starting to make invention in architecture, which is very different than, for instance, form invention in a more autonomous or isolated way. So I would say it's more about an approach than it is a specific technique or
Yeah, no, on the other hand, I would say that there's lots of what you're saying that could be said about not only housing, but about everything else that you find your freedom in the constraints themselves. But I think housing is subject to incredible number of codes. But another thing that I find quite telling, and at least a couple of you actually, surprisingly in the US at this stage, have been working with prefabricated units. But that's also something that makes a big difference to the heroic years of modern architecture in a sense, no? That the role of prefabrication is not to achieve sameness or standardization, but your ambition, and that's the way you described it also very clearly, Michael, it was to achieve diversity. I think diversity is one of the things that is a reality of the societies we live in, and I think that's something that housing is beginning to, only very slowly, beginning to give a response to. And I think that's something, so that's probably one of the things that perhaps you could build on. What is the level of, what's the relationship between repetition and difference in a sense, because there's of course many rules that are forced by technology, but then in order to achieve many different ways or support many different ways of living. And I would say probably one thing of course that I appreciate about the 3 takes, and something that of course that's the ambition of any architect doing anything, is to go beyond the quantitative elements that housing put very much to the fore, into just being able to talk about quality, and within these very, very tight constraints and codes, finding the small pleasures of everyday life and being able to offer all that. Shall we? I think, sorry.
I just wanted to pick up on this, what Michael was saying about invention, and what is difficult about modular, which is that there's many aspects of invention, and many ways in which we try to resist repetition somehow, by creating variation, by creating diversity, by thinking not just about the 3-dimensional jigsaw puzzle that is housing, where you have the 1 to 4 bedroom types of unit that come together, but variation and diversity in how you live in the building, how you move from your unit to the shared spaces, how you move past through the shared garden to your apartment, or whatever it is, the kind of thinking about the itinerary of the inhabitants, and maybe the deviant itinerary of the visitor, and to get out of form and to get out of this kind of formal 3-dimensional puzzle, which is precisely what is so hard about modular.
Maybe just also to feed into that a little bit, I mean, I think that, also one of the things that is potentially, an inheritance that we had from the modernist period is obviously this kind of idea that everything has to be based on a grid, and everything has to be in some ways structured and rationally structured through this kind of organizational grid. But maybe one of the ways also of rethinking a little bit what these different forms of living could mean, or the diversity of that could mean, is also to rethink a little bit these modes of organization, or the modes of subdivision that could have. Obviously, it's maybe not as viable in larger scales, or maybe there's a kind of negotiation that needs to happen. But I think that one of the things that for me seems interesting, and also Michael showed that in the house, for example, which was a very, very different kind of response in how we would begin to think about kind of an interiority and the organization within what you think as a kind of arrival and and living spaces and what you relate to when you're actually in that kind of domesticity.
No, I think we have a slightly limited amount of time because you know that we have the IMPay celebration later on. So I'd almost like to open it to the students. If you have any questions, yeah, there's plenty of them. Do we have to? I think. Yeah.
Thanks. Thank you all for a great presentation. I just had a question that I guess would apply to each of your projects that you dealt with. What sort of obstacles did you have in terms of achieving the types of invention, especially with dealing with what I would call like a decentralized version of public housing or affordable housing, when you have Skid Row Housing Trust or you have the New York City Housing Authority? When these authorities or these governing bodies are your client, what sort of obstacles, what kind of challenges do you face when you're seeking to achieve these innovative strategies?
Well, the Housing Trust is a private nonprofit developer, so they're not an agency per se, but they partner with the housing agencies largely to a large extent for funding, but also that is really the pipeline through which many of the individuals who eventually live in those buildings come from. I think we'd have to be here for a long time to go through all of the challenges, or talk about how they have an effect on. The thing that I have found, though, is that the challenges, the majority of the challenges. There's two types of challenges. There's the typical quantitative challenges like cost and schedule, contractor pool and how you bid the projects and all of the things that are quite normal. And then there's the cultural challenges where trying to do something that's hasn't been done exactly in that way is hard to overcome at times, because there is a sense that if you do it differently, it opens up those agencies to risk, or it's going to cost more, or it's going to take a longer time. The way that we have been trying to deal with that, and have been fortunate to be able to deal with it in this way, is to work at a very, very early level with the developer, a very early moment with the developer, really at the inception of the project and at the site acquisition. To begin to be a part of the conversation with all of the different agencies and all of the different people who are involved in that conversation about how the project is going to move forward. And if you can do that and understand where the real anxieties are, then I think as architects we're remarkably equipped, given the tools we have, to begin to steer that conversation and create or to start to dissolve some of that sense of risk. Architecture has the ability, all you guys are going through this kind of education, to take, you learn to take very complex information and to make some clarity out of it, to be able to describe what those issues are, and then to be able to represent something that says both what that complexity is and how you might be able to work through it. And if you're given that opportunity by being there early enough, I think you have a much better opportunity to get closer to that invention that you want to try to achieve. If you come in late in the game, then you're mostly in a more responsive or reactive mode, and I think that becomes very difficult.
Hello, thank you all for your presentations. I had a quick question about specifically the prefabricated projects, the relationship between the individual and collective, and I guess in Mimi's presentation in the My Micro New York project, the choice to clad the building with sort of like this unified brick cladding instead of sort of expressing each individual unit as their own formally articulated thing from the exterior massing. So I was kind of wondering how that sort of relates to what you were talking about in terms of the individual and collective and sort of the utopian and dystopian readings of the project and the ideas of collectivity. And I guess the second part of the question, which is sort of applicable to everyone, is sort of how the architectural intent of collectivity actually carries out in implementation. I know in Michael's presentation he was talking a lot about the compression of like a microcosm of public spaces and collective ideas, and that's sort of being like a microcosm for the city. And so I guess I just wanted to ask more about the discrepancy between the architectural intent of collectivity and its actual implementation.
It's a great question. You know, there was a lot of political sensitivity about micro units, and we were right next to NYCHA housing, and given the history of tenement housing in New York, there was a lot of sensitivity that we were going back to tenement housing. We were not, but that was the perception, and so. Either that or that it was going to be a dormitory with, you know, transient NYU students and all this kind of thing. And so we very intentionally did not want to represent the individual scale of the unit on the facade. So that was very, very intentional. But also it was a kind of fun, you know, it's a mini me, you know, of the skyline of New York, which is how we interpret the project, you know, that at any scale, however small, the city is yours. The city is your home. And I would say, you know, in terms of the utopian, dystopian aspect of sharing, I think that it's an incredible buzzword right now, and it's getting to be very annoying in many ways. And there's a kind of commercialization of this idea of co-living, co-housing, sharing, particularly in New York, because unlike in Berlin, where there are very interesting experiments of Baugruppen, which means building group, where a collective of architects and friends will get together and develop together a housing project. Because it's so expensive in New York, it's not possible. And so there are companies like Commons and We Live who are entering into this realm. A lot of what is it's good and bad. It's good because there is a lot of desire for that, and it happens anyway. But the bad part is that it's commercialized, and there's a kind of, you know, Uber tech kind of cast on the whole thing, kind of curating your life, which is very annoying. So I'd say that's the kind of dystopian aspect of it, you know. Again, the grass is greener on the other side. I wish that there could be more opportunities here where, you know, private individuals can actually develop in a more organic way.
I think that's maybe the advantage of being in Europe. The projects that I showed were, or at least the second project that I showed was a kind of public-private initiative. So it's publicly subsidized, but it's actually run by a kind of cooperative, which means that everybody that lives there, in fact, almost invests a sum into it that keeps the project running. And that allows essentially the public, like say, shared areas to be maintained so that, you know, if, for example, this park were to be built, it would really have been an actively, you know, maintained kind of amenity in a way, and that, you know, in some ways, what's very frequently a type of structure also in Europe for that is that there is certain responsibilities that residents are expected to take up, so that, you know, certain. In order to live there, they have to work, for example, a few hours in the shop, the grocery store that's down below. So everybody takes like a few hours a week or something like that, and runs that. There's, you know, other things in which that structure is actually much more, let's say, complex and dynamic than what tends to be the case here. And I think that here, to a certain extent, because the kind of economies are so constrained in a way, it's very, very difficult sometimes to have, you know, amenities that really are you know, viable or that are maintained for a longer period.
I have a bit of a tangential question to housing, but it seems that issues of density in housing also come with issues of density in parking. And my group specifically has been dealing with parking in our urban scheme. And so I was just wondering how, yeah, I guess it's most relevant to LA. And I was just wondering how you resolve those issues, whether it's something that you think of after you've already designed your housing scheme, or just how it plays a role in that process.
It's a significant driver in all of the projects that we're involved in, because Los Angeles continues to be primarily a car city, although it's changing, it's evolving, and it's not only evolving in the way that it's probably evolving everywhere, but it's evolving generationally. There's much less of a connection to the car as generations of people who are starting to live in these buildings, as the younger generations start to be more in the city. And I also think that the idea of the car is changing. So on the one hand, we're dealing with it because there are code regulations that say you have to have a certain number of cars for the units and the occupants in the building. In that case, we're always trying to deal with the housing, or deal with the parking, both in an efficient way, but to, as best as possible, to make it a part of the sequence of events that make up a life in and around those buildings. So it's not something that's just completely isolated from the choreography of your daily life. That being said, I'm increasingly convinced that as architects, our dilemma is going to be a responsibility to forecasting the diminishment or maybe even the demise of the car, and what happens to those spaces after you've built them in 15 or 20 years. We're seeing that in some of the Skid Row projects, and we've dealt with that some there, because that population almost never has a car, and yet we're required to do parking at a code. Generally, we can negotiate it down a little bit, but you still have, for instance, in Star Apartments, I think we had 50 parking spots, and there's rarely more than 3 or 4 cars in that parking lot. In the most recent project that we just finished, called Crest Apartments, it's in the Valley, Los Angeles, in the San Gabriel Valley. We took a typology of housing called the dingbat, which generally has parking underneath it on the ground level, not submerged, but on the ground level. And then the apartments are built to the property lines up above that. What we did was to create a similar type of model, but that entire ground level is a more permeable park-like space with drivable landscape, and a kind of landscape that if you had to drive a car on, you can. There are even little curb stops, and there's some lines. But it acts on a day in, day out basis as really a landscape, as a sustainable part of the overall landscape on the site. That's one way that we're trying to telegraph what that's going to be like in the future, but I think the bigger problem is going to be when you have a 200-car parking lot in a building. What is that going to transform into in 15 or 20 years? Can that be designed in a way that you can begin to insert prefabricated units or some kind of a unit into it and grow housing within the armature of the parking that exists? Or does it become a different type of social space or community space or institutional space? I think that's a real question, and one that, as architects, that's a place where invention is going to be very much necessary.
Actually, to answer that question, in New York, NYCHA, the Public Housing Authority, has started to look at their parking spaces and realizing, A, they need money, B, we need to densify, and so they've actually issued a whole series of RFPs, requests for proposals, that that basically create development sites out of the parking lots. So it's directly related to your question. It's the, acknowledging the need to densify and also acknowledging that particularly millennials do not buy cars anymore. And then finally, I want to point you to one speculative project. It's called 9 by 18 by Peterson Rich Office, which looks at the module of the parking lot, 9 by 18, and proposes housing instead on the NYCHA property.
I had a question about the modularity. I was wondering what you guys feel or what you think about the limitations of like a highly modular housing complex. I think, I don't know, I was just wondering what you think are the types of variations. I think Jeanette described an image of on the last image that you ended, as allowing opportunities for a variety of different lifestyles. I was wondering if, and of course there's an aspect of efficiency, especially for housing, that comes into play that requires, to a certain extent, like a modularity within the system. But I wonder if it actually does allow what we claim for it to allow, like what is the limits of this variation in lifestyle that it allows, and whether or not that actually, I wonder if it's like one of the remnants of modernism that you were mentioning that maybe does need to be pushed further. I don't know, limitations of modularity within housing.
So I think that, within each project, in a way, you kind of have to negotiate or to find that kind of moment of opportunity. In the case of that particular project that you're referring to, for us, it was much more about introducing this idea of a kind of continuous living landscape. So the kind of compartmentalization, that's something that comes as a sort of second move that then introduces in a way the let's say the possibilities to reconfigure in the end. So the structure itself is something that actually still allows for future sort of adaptation or readaptation of this kind of living landscape. I think that to a certain extent, the modularity in that sense is not so much about a base module, but it's much more about a system. Meaning that it's a kind of structural system or it's a system of infrastructure there, and in plan and in section, it may begin to be configured very, very differently. So that was the kind of ambition of that project. And obviously, these were both competitions in a way that had that are meant to be built. I mean, we didn't win the second one; we won the first one. But the kind of constraints of that, in order to kind of bring it to fruition, is much more severe than if this was a kind of ideas competition. So in some ways, again, the constraints in which you begin to operate is very, very different. And there we have to see what that kind of what diversity can mean in that scenario. For us, it's also, even with that system, which seems to be quite rigid, in fact, it introduces a whole catalog of the 20, 30 different types of units that you can derive out of that, just by, going also multiple floors, or by even reconfiguring in terms of the types of apartments and the ways in which the rooms are organized within it.
So I was very interested, Michael, in your characterization of the kind of ideological fight that was taking place while you were at school here, sort of between modernity and post-modernity. And so as just sort of retroactively surveying the presentations after having heard that comment, I was asking myself, well, which one? And it seems to me as though both, but in very different venues. So if I just survey the build work, including modernity one, each elevation of every project is very interested in sort of expressing the coherence of its measures, or of its the kind of clarity of its intellectual conceit. There's a kind of form of modern honesty to each one, and sort of surveyed from the outside. But when it comes to the project of representation, how they are drawn, to my mind, like clearly post-modernity So I'm wondering, I don't know if that reading is totalizing in its accuracy, but it's maybe a possible reading. And so I'm curious as to why. It seems like there's a desire to miniaturize and render friendly in terms of representation. Maybe deliberately not making the heroic claims that the kind of modern agenda would have been very interested in. But is this sort of bifurcation anything you guys have kicked around in your offices? Or have you thought about it all, like possible splits between the project and its drawings?
I don't think we've necessarily thought about it clearly in that way. I mean, I think that for us, it's not so much a kind of miniaturization as a way of finding a way of working that allowed us to get into the space. So in fact, these were literally model shots of large models that we would build in order to understand what that would mean. So for us, maybe the difference between, or let's say, how it moved from the modernist to the what you would call a kind of postmodern is also an idea of the objective versus the subjective. I think at the modernist stage, it very much rested at the level of a system and the level of the building as an object. What we're much more interested in is how do you then occupy that space, and how would you as a kind of subject experience that? So in all of these cases, in a way, we were interested in exploring the let's say the richness you could get, or how much can you milk that system in order to get a kind of variety and a richness and a diversity out of that. That was with the second project. With the first one, was also in terms of rethinking, again, this idea of what exactly the kind of living unit and the subdivisions might mean, that we're not always really thinking about it as a grid, but really thinking about it in terms of the characteristics of that as a form that you would occupy.
It's really interesting because we have the same conversation about subjective versus objective, and that is the goal of our drawings, actually. When I was here, there was a kind of general confusion of what the hell is deconstruction and what is anybody talking about? So it was a different, but so for us, we don't see it as a split. It's actually the two sides of architecture for us. What it takes to get something built, which we say is the objective, the kind of the obsession about tectonics, materiality, construction, etc., and then how you live in it. And so we've been experimenting with the living drawing, which one of which I showed you, and so that kind of, similar to Jeanette, like how do you occupy it? What changes? What is transforming? What's fixed versus what's not fixed?
I'm not sure I can. I'm not sure what I would say about the representation question, because that question is a significant one for me, and we talk about it quite a bit in the office, but in a different way, not exactly in the way that you were describing. I thought when you were first asking the question, it was more a question of what ended up having more of an influence even on the buildings themselves, postmodernism or modernism, and where did that trajectory continue to go? And maybe it has to do with the representation a little bit as well, but I think it wasn't so much in my mind that modernism won or postmodernism lost, maybe, depending on, I guess if you're a postmodernist, you thought you're still fighting, but that the effect of the belief in the power of or the value of complexity was something that did in a way influence modernism, re-influence modernism. The idea of thinking about housing not only as the unit or the module and the sort of insular mechanics of that, but that housing would have other complexities that related to the city, whether it was representing that, other complexities in terms of the kind of volumetrics of it, other complexities in terms of the infusion of different scales of program into those projects. And in all cases, their relationship to the city as opposed to a more discrete tabula rasa. I think those are all things that did have a real effect. And maybe that ambition towards or comfort with complexity might have even had an effect on the way that architecture continues to be represented now.
Okay, perhaps I'm not quite entitled to say anything because I didn't present any work and cannot. But and I should have. But I think on the one hand, a couple of issues in that, because I think it's a very interesting topic for the students. And I think on the one hand, I would say that really one of the differences that I wouldn't say that there's a divide anymore. I think we're all to some extent postmodernists in a sense, because we're beyond that. But it's not either or, for sure. And one of the things for sure is the way that we engage with the city. So to start with, housing is no longer housing, full stop. I think housing is housing as it informs an urban condition, as it's born from an urban condition, it feedbacks into it and shapes open space and so on and so forth. On the other hand, also this, for me, and I think that's, I don't know, we can actually continue this conversation later with you, Andrew, probably. There's something about an ideal that might have to do also with the project of representation, but I think it goes beyond that. And I could also think that there's no contradiction in trying to push forward ideas that of the core, really the hardcore years of modernism with Ernst May and Gropius and whatever, and finding certain disciplines almost scientific about housing, while at the same time bringing the small pleasures of everyday life in the way that you have a shower in the morning, you have breakfast with your friends, and so on and so forth, which is, in a sense, for me, some people that actually were beginning to deal with that seriously were the very late Allison and Peter Smithson. And I think that's some people that actually did have a project of representation and did have a commitment to both housing and whatever. And just, but I think that's almost another conversation we should continue. There were some more questions there, but yeah. Okay.
It's a sort of question that also addresses this modern, postmodern divide, and comes back to what you were also asking about modularity. I was really intrigued by both your presentations in the New York and the LA case, where you are in a way using this sort of inner life that is kind of a Taylorist, functionalist, rationalized, modular intestine of the project, and outside it's not being revealed at all. It can be seen as a sort of contradiction. Can be seen as whatever, but I'm just really curious, what is the math behind prefabrication in both of your projects? It seems to me such a small scale that I would wonder, how is it rational as a sort of economics of the project? And you're obviously not keen to show it, but as we saw in the video in the Brooklyn Navy Yard, it has its sort of modernist, Taylorist moment that you are owning that. But then you say, I don't want it to be next to the NYCHA building because there was tension. And similar to your example, this flying building, it's almost reminding me of Bofil's early work in Barcelona, this sort of dense cluster, but which is custom built. And yours is using a tray and colonizing it with these modules. They're also my question. Is there really an economic reason to bring the things from Boise, Idaho? It's
that's something that we looked at quite a bit, because it has been a real question, and it's a big part of the equation in terms of the developer, even a nonprofit developer, believing that this was a reasonable way to build a building. When we did the majority of our research, it looked to be the cutoff point. This is very specific, but the cutoff point was about 70 to 72 units. Below that, for us, we couldn't really make the modularity work given some of the economies like transportation, how far all of the modular factories were from Los Angeles, given the labor force, given the cost of the crane, really all of the pieces of the business case, the economic model for the developer. But above that, it did start to begin to have a positive effect, or it started to make sense. And it's not, the thing with that equation is it's not just whether there's a certain economy by producing a lot of those widgets, a lot of those particular, those individual units. Absolutely, the more that you build, the more economical it is. But there were other questions like in Star Apartments, there was almost no construction staging space. That part of the city is pretty dense, which meant that the cost of staging the construction was going to be very high. So if you could build a significant part of it, it lowered the general conditions for the contractor. The second thing was schedule. If you could lower the amount of time that the contractor was on site, you also significantly lowered the carrying costs for the owner. So putting all of those pieces, which are not specifically tied to a hard construction square footage cost, but are a part of the overall project budget, changes where that break-even point is. But there is a point where it starts to become very viable and can also be very viable for some of these other collateral. I would say one other thing, and it relates to what Mimi said, which had to do with the identity of the unit, the individual unit. For us, you can buy those units with the skin on them. You could choose to do that. We chose not to do that. And to a large extent, it was a very similar concern. We were concerned that the idea of producing something that looked like it was a lot of containers was sending a very bad signal to the people who were living inside the building. Not so much to the people outside, but to the people who had largely been living on the street up until that time. And that the building does represent something, not only to the city, but to the identity of the community inside it. So there's I think, a real question that modularity can have very positive effects, but with the business model, with the representation and identity of the building, it's not a panacea. It's not something that necessarily works everywhere. There's still fundamental questions, architectural questions that you have to work through.
We have to wrap up. I don't know whether there's any more questions we can take. Are there any more questions in here? Yeah?
Should we wrap up?
No. I was about to say that if there's one or two last ones, just like to, so you have the privilege to have the last word, Chris. Yeah.
Okay, I'll try my best. So my question is, I guess, when we talk about residential architecture, we generally talk about houses or housing, the latter referring, I think, at least connotatively to large-scale, repeatable, multi-building, urban level projects. But what interests me, and I think it came up a few times more today, is the apartment building, the 2 to 10 unit apartment building, whereas in the way that if housing is really the stuff of the city, like we were talking about earlier, in a city like Los Angeles, most people who do not live in a one-bedroom house live in a 2 to 10 unit apartment building, which is possibly closer to a house than to housing as such as we may think about it as a kind of urban design discipline. So I guess I wanted to ask you guys about the difference in your mind between working on those kind of projects. Michael, specifically with One Santa Fe definitely falling in the realm of housing, with the Star Apartments and maybe also, if I get the name right, the Carver Apartments, the round one on the 10, are closer to apartment buildings, and then Jeanette, your building, the first you showed, which are able to have, they're both able to have interiors and they're able to be holes in a way that housing have a harder time with. So I guess I just wanted,
I actually don't see a difference between housing and apartment buildings, because in New York, 3-family is housing. 3-family multi-family housing. It's actually a very general term, and in a way, like the lot that we got for the micro apartment building, typical units, it was 55 units. Typical units probably much less. I think that the opportunity to really control the kind of social dynamics may be more foregrounded in a smaller apartment building, possibly. But I think as you've seen in, larger projects today, still there's a lot of opportunity to, kind of craft those kind of social interactions. So, I mean, I think the scale of the community obviously changes. But I think in all of our projects, we're trying to create degrees of that interaction. And I would say that, is back to the question about modernism, that idea of complexity, nested scales of communities, that is very different from the kind of, modernist take on the plinth and then the living above.
I think also, one of the things that you have to think about is what exactly are you sharing and who are you sharing it with and with how many do you share that with? So for example, in the second project that I showed, which is a much, much bigger project than the first one is like 7 units, the second is like 300. But in a way, the organization is not so different because we were rejecting, and that happens also very much in Europe, in fact, or in Switzerland, is that there's almost no double-loaded corridors that are designed anymore. Most of the time, you want to have double exposure, and that's very difficult. Either you do a skip stop or you do other means of thinking about how you get up. The address, what you call the kind of address into the building, your front door, the stair that you share with everybody, that becomes the kind of way of measuring in terms of your immediate community. Let's say in that situation. There's a stair or a kind of elevator, probably feeding 15 units or something like that. It's not an immense amount. But it starts to kind of reshape it differently. If you thought of it as housing in the sense of this is a corridor that runs through the entire development, that's very, very different than if you think of it as these are actually just a bunch of vertical townhouses, in some ways aggregated together.
No, I think we have to just thank the three of you for the presentations, and particularly Michael and Mimi for being so available to the students. So thank you very much. Take care.